My initial thoughts are, and I think you see this coming through in a lot of the tweeting and blogging that I was quickly looking at during the election debate, was that Romney had quite a lot of energy. If you've thought of Romney as a kind of gaffe machine, as a bit of a fool of a candidate, he probably made a slightly better impression today, at least in his presentation, than you might have expected. I think a lot of the commentary on Obama will be reasonably critical, but I think he defended his positions on particular issues fairly well. Whether he had less energy or not, you know, that's for newspaper journalists and psychologists to argue about. I think the thing that I really like about the debates, as opposed to, say, a lot of what goes on in American politics with ads and conventions, is it is really a chance to discuss substance. And those of you who get really excited about tax policy, about health policy, about regulating Wall Street, this is really a moment to think about those issues. And I think there was some important contrasts on those issues, most starkly on health policy. Obama was defending what had occurred on his presidential watch, this Affordable Health Care Act, which he now is proud of this label Obamacare, which he tended to run away from about a year ago. And he's saying that is really bringing down the cost of health. It obviously covers more people, maybe up to 50 million Americans who didn't have coverage. Romney is making the argument that the private sector always does things better in terms of health care. I think the record on that is quite clearly untrue. I mean, the Americans have, I think, one of the more inefficient health systems in the world. I mean, if you're very wealthy, healthcare is terrific, but it's incredibly expensive healthcare in the United States, and it's a major problem for their federal deficit as a nation. So I think Romney on the details just couldn't get away from that faith in capitalism or free markets as a solution to everything. And it would be interesting maybe in later debates how these things will be picked apart, whether people go into the details and say, look, you've got to tell us what these exemptions are on taxation that's going to allow you to reduce rates. You've got to tell us how you can defend some of the highest costs of healthcare. So I think Romney, performed reasonably well, but there's two more debates to go, so I think it's really the start of a conversation. What were your impressions, Luke?
Well, I think you covered a lot of the points I was going to make, so thank you for that. But I think two larger points to start off with. First, I think it's important that everyone make up their own opinion of how it went. It's interesting in the media in the US, when people are asked how the debate went, their opinions will be much different, whether they just watched it and responded, or whether they had listened to the media narrative afterwards. The gaffes actually don't end up being as big when people just watch it. They focus more on substance. It's only after they end up hearing, oh, this candidate wasn't looking at the audience, or this candidate was gesturing too much, then this starts taking more importance in people's minds. So it'll be interesting how that's framed afterwards. I think the other big point is debates can matter, but they just don't matter that much. They can affect a race around the margins in a really close race, but they're not going to dramatically swing things. And if you do see a bump in the polls, it often resets within a couple of days or weeks. So I think Romney did reasonably well here, but it's the start of a much larger rehabilitation effort. This doesn't dramatically change the race. I thought Romney came out looking very strong, very presidential. In the last couple of weeks, Romney's campaign has been sort of gaffe prone, but it's created this sense that he's completely incompetent, which just isn't true. Coming into the debate, Americans 2-1 thought Obama was going to win the debate, which is actually a disadvantage for the president, because you want expectations to be low and you want to be able to exceed them. And I thought Romney certainly did that. I thought as the debate went on, Obama started to look stronger. I thought he gave one of the best defenses of Obamacare that I've seen him do. Democrats in the past were quite reluctant to talk about it in any significant ways, but I think they've made stronger arguments in favor of it recently. The other point that Obama made that stood out to me is when he called Romney out on being vague about what policies he would particularly put in place. You heard Romney alluding to things he liked in the Dodd-Frank Wall Street reform or things he liked in Obamacare, but he wouldn't really say how what he would do instead. And so I think that was a strong point when Obama said you have to offer something else if you like these ideas. And so overall, I think Romney did well. He might get a little bump, but I'd be surprised if it changes things that much.
I think the last point I'll make, and then I think we should have some questions, is that these debates, I think, are one of the good things about the American political tradition, that in many regards, we looked at the conventions, we might think we could do without some of that overexcitement in Australia, but I think in Australia there's tendency to have very short debates between the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, one debate usually half an hour or so. This American tradition, these debates, as you saw, with no clapping or sort of gasping during when they were making the commentary, 3 long, pretty substantive debates. Now they could, for some of us, they could get into more detail, but I think as political moments, they're pretty interesting and to some degree a bit of a model. I think really where we see some impact of these debates in the past is if they really reinforce a pre-existing stereotype. And this happened with Gerald Ford in 1976. Ford was thought of as maybe the George W. Bush of his time, not the brightest man that had ever been a leader. And he made this statement where he said there was no Soviet control over Eastern Europe. And the moderator gasped and said, well, what are you saying, Mr. President? Is, you know, in what sense do you mean this? And Ford backed it up and didn't move away from that in the next sort of coming week. And it gave this impression that Gerald Ford really didn't know what he was talking about, which wasn't that helpful for Ford in a very close race with Carter that year. Whereas occasionally politicians like Reagan, and maybe to some extent George W. Bush in the year 2000, have bucked against an existing trend that they're a weak debater, that they can't really foot it, say, in Bush Jr.'s case with Al Gore, where Bush did pretty well and people thought, okay, well, he's not as weak on the details or as a debater as some thought. Where Gore, people thought he was one of the great debaters of American politics before the 2000 election. They started to think, well, this guy is really annoying, or he's not such a great debater, even though he's, you know, fine intellect. So it's when it bucks against kind of strong existing, I think, stereotypes that the debates, you know, they're not crucial, as Luke says, but they can play a role. Does anyone want to start us off with a question to either of us?
Just a comment. How do they know that they're uncommitted voters that are doing that worm thing? Because you could stack it if you wanted to, like juries are often stacked. But secondly, it showed the clear difference between women and male voters, because male were consistently higher for Romney than the other one.
Which is the way in the general population. There's about a 10% or 12% gap that women favour Obama over Romney, and they favour the Democrats increasingly over the Republicans. So there would have been a lot of market testing. These people would have been put through a political sort of, you know, gymnasium test of sorts to make sure that they were fairly uncommitted. And I suppose that adds to, I think they were nice touches, not just the graph, but the timing. It's often really interesting in your own mind which candidate you think speaks the longest in these debates. And quite often the impression you have is wrong. That one candidate seems to be talking all the time. And that was often the impression with Gore and Bush Jr., that you had the sense that Gore was talking all the time and Bush wasn't really getting his chance, where they had about 50-50 in terms of time. But those clocks, I think, were quite useful, and Obama had quite a bit more time, didn't he? Question
in the back?
Which candidate looked more presidential?
Yeah, well, as I said at the beginning, I thought Romney came out looking very presidential, and I think just being there and being on equal footing with the president instantly lends you some credibility. So, I mean, Obama's been president. I think he continued to look presidential as he has over the last 4 years, but the big change here was that Romney had a chance on a national stage to look smart and competent, and I think he did that.
Another question up the back?
Which candidate, if any, do you think, like if there was a vote the next day, which candidate, if any, do you think won more votes, like from an uncommitted group, like managed to, with their performance in the debate, was managed to convince more undecided voters to their side?
It's a really good question, and many of you might have been thinking, How come Obama never mentions George W. Bush? How come he almost never said the Republicans did all these really bad things in the last 8 years before I was president? And there was a lot of things you can pin on the Bush administration. And he never used Bush's name directly. And this is because he's targeting this group of people you're talking about. These uncommitted voters who they've clearly sort of done market research on, and these people keep saying to them, we don't want to hear you trash the other party. We don't want to hear you talk about how bad the Republicans or the Democrats are. We want to hear positive messages. Now, I think this type of politics can go too far. And I think we saw maybe an exaggerated form of it tonight, but I think that's the group that have been targeted. And it's a bit like reading the tea leaves, entirely guessing who would have won. What do you think, Luke? Do you think?
Yeah, I agree with you. It's reading the tea leaves. It's kind of hard to put yourself in these voters' shoes. One point to make is that undecided voters generally don't care about politics that much, so they're the least likely people to actually be watching these debates. But my guess is that if you see a bump in the polls, I bet it would be towards Romney, just because, as I said, his expectations were lower coming in, and I think he exceeded those low expectations. So my guess is, if it helped anyone, it helped Romney at the margins.
A question here?
Not quite a question, I guess it is a question. I feel that Obama held back. I felt he was really, like he was sick or something, was my sense, He got a cold, and he was hesitating so much. Romney was so well prepared. I mean, they really got him up to snuff, didn't they? And Obama was very flat and very hesitant in his answers. Maybe I haven't heard him speak enough, but I thought he was really staccato kind of in the way he talked.
Yeah, that was how the New York Times was calling it as I was watching the debate on their website. They were sort of saying, fire up Obama, you get a bit more energy. Romney looks like he's had a sort of extra bowl of Cheerios, was their way of describing it on the Times website. And I think Obama, he has this interesting contrast that he is this terrific public speaker when he can really turn it on, and we knew that in 2008 in a very big way, that he is, a very charismatic speaker. But he also has this side that other people find a bit introverted, that he likes in some ways to get into the details, to be in a term that's not one that I'm glad is a term of abuse, but it is nonetheless to say he's professorial, that he enjoys nothing more than going back to his office, reading over the details, considering these things, and not always being that, taken by having to be in the public spotlight all the time. And tonight maybe was a little bit of that. And I suppose when you're in the job for quite a long time, it's like musicians who perform at concert after concert. It's pretty hard to get yourself up for these things. And I wouldn't suggest Obama should start taking performance-enhancing substances, but over time this becomes harder and harder. And you do see this with quite a lot of politicians, that they start to become a little flatter as their career goes on, where Romney, this is all new. This is the first time he's been in one of these debates.
He didn't say much, but he did it well.
Question there?
How effective do you think were the responses to the question on partisanship gridlock?
I was actually doing an interview during that part, so maybe you should answer that.
Okay. This is a major problem at the moment in the United States, this sense of a total lack of cooperation between the Obama White House and the Republicans in the House of Representatives. There's, inactivity is the main game in American politics. That's what happens most of the time. Things don't get done, they get frustrated. And so I thought they were both pretty glib on this front. Romney saying, well, I've worked with the other side in Massachusetts. Well, he's been running away from that record for most of this year. So he's now sort of refining that. Obama, I think, hasn't been particularly good on this front. This gets back to the Obama as, in some ways, a bit of a reluctant glad-hander and politician. that he doesn't like having to, be nice constantly to John Boehner and his crowd, who he clearly, I think, has a degree of contempt for. And most of the sort of really insightful books about Obama that are coming out now, the Bob Woodward book, a Ron Seskheim book, are all making this point that Obama really struggles to reach across the aisle. Now, there might be good reasons for this, but it's possibly necessary as one of you in your political toolkit.
In the back, did you? No.
I was just going to make a comment about what you said earlier about their different composures. And I took it quite the opposite way, in that Obama I saw him as being more composed, not necessarily introverted. And I think Romney in a few ways came out sounding a bit almost flustered in his vagueness. Like, I think when they were talking about the tax code particularly, at least that's how I took it, in trying to kind of explain his view on the taxes without actually saying what he was going to do.
Yeah.
It just seemed a little bit repetitive, his like one-line explanation of it, that he's not giving this $5 trillion tax cut instead of actually.
I also think part of the difference in their approach affected the standing in the race. Obama's ahead. He's kind of doing this play it safe strategy, and I think you're right, he took a little too far, but Romney has to go for broke. He's behind, so high risk, high reward, more aggressive strategy is probably what he needs.
Question there, and then behind.
It's generally considered that there are probably only 3 presidential election debates, 60, 76, and 2000, that were really telling in deciding the election outcome. You mentioned 76. Do you think, quite frankly, that this debate is just going to fade into election debate obscurity, and it's not going to present the decisive game changer that Romney actually needs?
I think I wrote an article which came out today predicting dullness, which is not what you want to do when you're holding an event like this, that it might not be as exciting as some of the previous years. And I think there are probably a few reasons for that Obama is going to play it safe. He's got a pretty good lead at the moment. That Romney, he did try to show us that he has a humorous side tonight. I don't know if a career in comedy is likely if he doesn't become president, but he's obviously got a few people writing these lines for him. But whether they change the game or not, I think they do provide important kind of details for the record. And this is why I really like these debates, that I get the candidates, and hopefully in a more specific way in the next 2 debates, to come out and say, okay, if I'm going to not cut taxes, which Romney's arguing that taxes will not be increased at the end of the kind of period that the Bush tax cuts have been extended to the end of this year, what are those deductions, Mr. Romney, that you're going to find? And I think as the debates go on, he'll be under pressure to name them. He'll be under pressure to say, well, it might have to be in this area here. Now, he's very slippery on this tonight. But I think these debates are the best chance to get to those details. Now, that might not be a game changer, but after the election, it allows at least for politicians to come back in Washington and say, okay, this is kind of what you promised in a very, very national way on the national stage.
But the voters in the meantime might not be listening to that detail. The voters will matter.
Yeah, I mean, this is a weird science, the science of electoral politics, and the things that matter in the end in those 2 crucial states in Florida and Ohio, a real mixed bag. What's going to be the ballot items that the parties are going to put forward in Ohio will matter. In 2004, there was a ballot item which wanted to create a ban on gay marriage in the state of Ohio, and this probably got up the number of conservatives who came out to vote. It helped Bush. It didn't maybe win him the election, but it helped win him the election. And now that's the kind of thing we're not obviously talking about today. A question from behind?
Yeah, how useful or elucidating do you think these debates are? Because I think it more resembles sport than any sort of constructive activity. Somebody says something that's inaccurate, and it's going to take you 10 minutes to really get into the detail to refute it, sort of thing. So when Romney gets a response, he might say 5 things, and maybe 2 of them Obama could rebut or something, but he doesn't have 20 minutes to do that. Do you think that these debates are useful?
What do you think, Luke? Sport more than politics?
Yeah, but But I was kind of impressed at how detailed some of this policy discussion did go, though. I thought the discussions of Dodd-Frank and of Obamacare were more detailed than we've seen at most points in the campaign. But yeah, the general point is right. There's so much being said and so much quoting of studies, and most people's eyes just glaze over, and it's very hard to fact check all of these kind of things. I think it's in the post-debate spin and narrative where the broader ideas will start to come out. You'll hear recurring themes of Obama repeatedly said this, that wasn't true, or Romney was really vague about criticizing this. And so I do think it crystallizes a little more after the debate and starts giving voters cues and signals.
But you're right, they're not really debates, they're dueling speeches. They talk about what they want to talk about a good deal of the time as well, not what the questions they're asked, which is, this is how you'd be coached to play this.
I have a question on Obamacare. In the American public, what's the big issue with the policy? Is it the fact that it's state-sponsored healthcare, or is it the fact that it's affecting the private sector, or?
It's a complicated question, and Brendon can also weigh in on this. I think the big thing is it was just passed during a very contentious time when the economy was doing incredibly bad and it was dragging out, and you had the Tea Party sort of movement coming up. Obama's ratings were plummeting just because the economy wasn't doing well. So I think it's a product of those larger factors. There's just an inherent distrust amongst the public of government programs, and they see it. And if you can frame something as big government or a threat to existing program like Medicare, which is a government program, then it's easy to make it unpopular. There's fairly low knowledge amongst the public about what the bill actually does. When you say, do you like Obamacare? Most people will say no. When you pull out specific portions of it, like you saw Obama trying to do today, and say, do you like having coverage for pre-existing conditions? People say, yeah, I love that. But as a whole, it's not as popular.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the really interesting parts of the debate today about Obamacare was Romney kept saying, we'll send things back to the states. We'll let the states decide about what will be done. And that's fine if you live in Massachusetts or you live in a lot of the sort of New England states. If you live in Mississippi or you live in Alabama, you're going to get a rough deal under Romney's plan. I mean, if it's a much more private sector driven model, many people in those poorer states are really going to miss out. So those are the people that Obamacare has really helped, who didn't have coverage previously, working poor people, but they're not big voters. And this has been one of the real big problems with this bill, that the people that it's most helped and supported are the least likely to be politically active. And it's one of these, I think, good policies that he probably isn't always going to get an enormous amount of benefit from politically.
One more potential problem with the state-by-state model is it's just very hard to do these kind of programs in each state, because the way that it works in Massachusetts is, if you're young, you have to have insurance, and that kind of subsidizes the poorer and sicker people, their coverage. And so there's complicated reasons why it worked in Massachusetts, but as a general model, you're going to have healthier people leaving the state because they don't want to have to buy coverage, and you're going to have less healthy people moving into the state. So unless it's done on a national level, it's very tough to replicate that model state by state by state.
We might have one last question up the back, and then anyone else can come and have a chat to us at the end. And we've got another one of these things going next Friday, so the fun never ends. You want to have a question there? Yeah.
What kind of influence do like presidential candidates have on the results in the House and the Senate? Do most people vote all along party line? They vote Democrat House, Democrat Senate, Democrat like President. Do they follow that kind of step? Do people sort of flick around? How much of an influence do presidential candidates have on those sort of votes?
It's a very good question, and I suppose one of the big factors in what you're saying is turnout. You want to get your enthusiastic supporters to turn out, and you obviously want to raise turnout on your side, and this flows on. So if people were thinking, well, Romney is not going to win, it's pretty inevitable he's going to lose, those who maybe don't think about those lower house races or races in the state, at the state level, might not turn out to vote. Now those people might be staunch Republicans and they might vote down the ticket if they turn up, but that suppression of turnout can have a pretty big impact on those races down the ticket. There are some people that split their ticket, but they're not in the main, they're not a big group. The majority of people, if they turn out, I think, Luke, are going to vote for one particular party.
Yeah, I find the interplay between who you vote for in state and congressional races and who you vote for in the presidential level very interesting. There is a strong coattail effect, but people can all, there's also, it's more complicated than that too. A state like West Virginia is going to vote Republican overwhelmingly in the presidential election, but they vote Democrats. They have 2 Democrats in the Senate, and they're going to vote a Democrat back in this year, but you have a Democrat senator there who really distances himself from the president. And recently you've seen Republicans are losing their chance to take back the Senate, but that actually has more to do with problems with their candidates within those states than Romney's unpopularity as a whole. So coattails do matter a lot, but state issues take precedence in a lot of cases.
What was the ad, Luke, that the senator, Senator Minkin? Or
Joe Manchin, yeah.
Manchin, what was the ad that he used? It was a target with a gun?
Right, so Democrats had been pushing a cap and trade bill, which is very unpopular in West Virginia because it's a coal-producing state. And so Manchin was distancing himself from the other Democrats and saying, I'll take dead aim at a cap and trade bill. And he had a rifle in his hand, and he shot the bill a couple times during target practice. So it was a good way of appealing to gun owners and coal workers.
Yeah, and he's a Democrat, so cap and trade is a bit like a kind of carbon tax bill here. Anyway, thank you for your time. Thanks for coming along.